So I got to Piney Point, Maryland after my 60 days in boot camp, and but because I was had motor experience, working in a trucking company and different things, they put me on little boats where we retrieved the torpedoes. But I had different jobs because I had truck driving experience. They made me a driver, and but that wasn't all my job. That would be if I had weekend duty, I'd have to stand shore patrol, or I'd have to go to Bainbridge, Maryland, where they tested all ammunition and guns, and then I'd haul coal with a 20-foot semi. I knew how to, because I worked in a freight yard, putting trailers up to the docks. I knew how to drive a semi, and for some reason or another, they would tag me as a driver. So, but on weekends, I'd have to drive a busload of the boys, the sailors, to Washington, D.C., about 60 miles from the base, and they'd be so I didn't have any money usually, so I'd just pull in the Washington Navy Yard with the bus, and the guys would get unloaded, and I'd go to sleep on the floor in there. We had nothing else, right on the deck in part of the Navy Yard where they played all the games and such. And so I'd wait till 2 o'clock in the morning, and they'd come back, all of them pretty well under the weather with all their drinking and such. Then I'd have to drive the 60 miles back from about 2 o'clock till morning. That was really bad to stay awake. But then that would be a weekend duty. So then on other weekends I'd have shore patrol duty, so I'd wear the shore patrol on my arm, the SP for showing that you were an officer, and then I'd drive a truck, weapons carrier that would hold about 6 people. It was a pretty heavy type of a vehicle, and take them to the different bars. And they had one near the base called the Tall Timbers. And I remember we had to stay there, kind of stand all night to watch, so we wasn't laying around wearing a uniform. We were on duty. And I'd be watching the sailors getting drunker and drunker all night. And then it seemed like the littler guys would get drunk first, and I could carry them. So they'd fall down on the floor, and then I'd somehow get them over my shoulder, take them out to the weapons carrier to take them back to base, only a mile or so away. And I'd feel like putting them in the brig. Brig is a jail for the Navy, and but I never did. I'd just take them in and carry them in the barracks and lay them on their bunk. I'd know what bunk they were on, and so that was one of the duties I had. And another one was driving a coal truck. It was a short semi. We had to load it with a shovel and unload it with a shovel, and it held about 10 tons. So it was a big job, but 2 of us. I had a helper, and we would haul coal sometimes. And then another duty we had was running the fire. We'd have fire duty, weekend fire duty. So I stood that for almost all the while I was there on weekends. And but one time we had to use it, but the fire engine would only run about 15 miles an hour, didn't have any power, and because it didn't have power, we removed the muffler on it, and the engine made more noise than the siren. But they had a fire on a little house on the island, which was about a mile or so from the base, but they had no fire stations there. But the Navy took over. So I remember driving the 6x6 right down in the water, because they were all 6-wheel drive, and it's all sand, and dropping the tube over the side to suck the water out, the suction tube, and start the big Cummins engine, and the boys would strung out the hose up to the house, and so they were giving them some water. So when I revved the engine up a little bit, they were screaming and hollering. The the hose went up in the air and all the shingles came off of the little shanty flying up in the air. It made a groove right through the roof of the thing. But anyway, that's about the only time I ever had a fire with that. So that was my duty there. But because I was a driver, I'd have to sometimes go in the airplanes. They had one was a P-47, that was a torpedo bomber, and the little ones were trainers. And when the water was real heavy, the waves were high. We called it heavy water. You couldn't find the torpedoes. They had a dummy head on them, but the smoke would come out. They had a steam turbine and they ran on alcohol. And the little one was a Mark 13, run 13 miles at 60 knots. And the Model 21 would run 21 miles at 60 knots. Well, that was a long ways from the barge. So sometimes in the heavy weather, the torpedoes, they running on alcohol, had a smoke stream coming out of it. So that's what you'd look for. So they'd put me in the plane when the aviation mech would play sick, and it was open cockpit in the winter. And they'd give me what they called winter weather was all buckskin and lamb's wool. And that thing, they put that hood on me, or that cap, that silly cap, and the wind would from that engine. I was right in back of the engine because the pilot was behind me, because it was a trainer plane, and that's where they had to be to watch the guys flying the planes. So they would find the torpedo out there with the smoke coming out. It was deep in the waves, and tell the torpedo retrievers how to pick it up or where to pick it up and guide them to it. So that was one of my duties. And then sometimes I'd have to be in the P-47, and they would try testing the Mark 13s, a 13-foot long. They were shorter, and they'd go in a plane. And they'd go up to 5,000 feet, so they'd get enough speed, and then they'd come down at about 500 miles an hour. When they got close to the water, about 200 feet, they'd drop the torpedo, so it would make this run. And I'm not sure why they would do it, but sometimes they would porpoise and come back out of the water, and the steam turbine would blow its whole head, they'd say it, and it would sink, because it'd have a hole in it, because they had that air in there to hold it up in the water till you could pick it up with a retriever. So, but that was when they'd make the turn, the pilot on purpose would make it, you couldn't even move your eyes, the pressure was so bad. But I'm trying to watch the torpedo, because if it did porpoise, maybe that night I'd have duty on the diving boat. They call it diver tender. And to pick up the torpedoes off the bottom of the Potomac was about 140 feet deep. They'd always sink way down in the mud, but that was bad duty, because we'd be sitting there waiting for listening to the divers talking down there. And they had two different divers. One would go for whatever time, then we had to run him back and put him in a decompression lung to bring him back up to earth, and then go back down to take the air slower in his body, and then it wouldn't cause the air bubbles, and they call it the bends. So we had to decompress in the person. So that was our duty, one of our duties. But then sometimes that night we had to have tender duty to take the officers back to the base and pick them up and take them back that lived on the barges, because each barge had an officer, because it was really a small Navy community in there with the people that took care of the torpedoes and loaded them and fired them and all that stuff down the ranges. They had 4 barges, and they had sailors sitting on each barge. They'd be maybe a mile apart, and then they could check the speed of the torpedo and how high or low it was running in the water. So that was the duty we'd have there. But then sometimes I'd have to go to Bainbridge, Maryland, where they tested all the guns in the Navy there, and up to 18 inches that went on battleships, but they never put the 18s into service. They had 16 inches. The 18s was about 10-foot tall, the projectile. They were put with, they fired those by bags of powder in the cannons. But they had a little island there, and they'd shoot every kind of a gun there was onto that island. It was a forest to start with, and by the time I had seen it, you couldn't see anything there, and they said it was the size of toothpicks, everything on the island. It was all day long, and those shooting platforms was probably 300 feet long, and the guns and the pom-poms and all the kinds of machine guns, everything there was would be firing all day long there, by the probably thousands of rounds a day that filing onto that little island. So that was one of my duties there in the Navy, and then finally I got into the shop overhauling engines. So I was a diesel. I mostly worked on large engines, and the diesels I worked on would have crankshafts about 8 feet long, because we had a table we'd put them on and mount them on, and a rack. And then we'd start with them. Take about 6 weeks. We had to scrape in the mains and rod bearings. They were Babbitt, and fit them. And then we'd build it up, and take 6 weeks, and we'd start it. So I remember at the end of the war, I had just overhauled one for 6 weeks. Well, you couldn't turn them off when you started them for about 8 hours of running, because if you would, they'd freeze up. They had to break in on that charge. You ran a water hose to it, and then you ran fuel to it. And then you had a battery laying there so you could start it. And so as I was running, I heard something going on. I looked out. We had about 40 boats in our harbor there for different reasons on the torpedo testing range. And a couple of them were tugs. And the tugs had, some of them had steam-type whistles on them. So I heard that thing go off, and I looked up, and I seen the steam coming out of the tugs, and I knew that I thought there was a fire. So I had that engine started, and I couldn't turn it off, and a sailor come by and hollered in my ear, the Japs just surrendered, we're going home. But I stayed there for another year, still overhauling, so that ended that summer I was discharged from the Navy, and then came back to Detroit, and my brother-in-law and I that grew up together decided we'd both work from Uncle, and I was into mechanics in the Navy so much, we decided to start a garage, and so we went down at Fort Street and Trumbull, and we rented a one-stall garage, a little old barn, and it had a dirt floor in it, but it had a rack there, and we had a chain fall, so we started overhauling engines. We'd paint them all up fancy, and everybody that would, they got a good word, so we were too busy for that one stall. So my brother-in-law went over on Cass Avenue, and he found about a 20 stall building in an alley. What was a garage? So, and they called it 3T Garage. It was 3 people who owned it, and their last name ended in a T. And so we bought them out for a few dollars, and then we moved over there, and we started. So we had a room for about 20 cars. But the cars were hard to fix. They were almost unfixable after the war. They were so rusted out, and everything was worn out. And back then, an engine didn't last very long, 35,000 miles. It had to be overhauled. But we really couldn't fix the cars right, and we couldn't afford that much overhead and not have help. So after a while, we decided, well, we're going to close it. So we sold out to a guy by the name of Don Calloway. He was a Tiger player, and he had his buddy he wanted to put in there, and so he bought us out. And so I went in working in dealerships doing body work, because I'd learned how to do body work by doing my own car in the Navy. I bought an old car for 25 bucks and built it up and painted it, and it looked real good, and I sold it after when I was ready to come home was a 33 Ford Coupe. But anyway, so I got there, and then I didn't have anything, but I had this 32 Ford that my dad had overhauled when I had it in the CCC, and so I had that to Detroit, but I sold that, and then I bought a 36 Ford working in my uncle's gas station, and then I bought a 40 Ford. But anyway, so finally after I got drafted, and then I got in the Navy, then we got back to the garage, and then I started working in dealerships, and so then I had working in dealerships, and I was working in a Ford dealership in Detroit, and called Southwestern Motors, and that's where I bought my 40 Ford from a few years before that. But anyway,